Good evening. I hope you're all there and can hear me. Welcome to this Halloween special dealing with Count Dracula. All right, let's get to it. I hope you can see and hear me, but we'll find out. I'm usually just being paranoid. All right, I see a comment saying we're live. I think that means you can see and hear me. Good. All right, let's do it. All right, so thanks for joining me. It's Halloween week, and I figured I'd talk about something that is relevant to it, namely the king of all spooks, Dracula, because I actually know a thing or two about him, the real Dracula and the fake Dracula. And it's actually going to make for a very interesting discussion to figure out what it's all really about going on with Hollywood, the fake fictitious Dracula, the real Dracula, how they coincide and what it all means, especially in the context of Halloween. So actually, let's start with a few words about Halloween. I guess to most of us, you grow up in America, and Halloween's just a time where people scare each other, play games, and kids go around begging for treats or something. Uh, I think I did it one time when I was a kid, and I was very, very young, and my immigrant Coptic paranoid mother, of course, convinced me when I came home that all the candies that I had gotten had razor blades in them, so I didn't really eat, or we actually had to go through them meticulously. But hey, that does happen. It was a good point. At any rate, let's discuss the real Halloween, or how we know it. And of course, to those in the know, Halloween is a Christian holiday. Okay, look at the very words. It's made up of two words: hallowed, like hallowed be thy name, to make something holy. And the second part, the een, I believe, doing quick research, that's sort of the Scottish or maybe a Gaelic kind of pronunciation for evening, because Halloween is the night before All Saints' Day, another Christian holiday that venerates and observes and remembers saints, holy people, which is on November 1st. And we know all this, in fact, because a pope, I think in the 9th century, dedicated a chapel to all the saints in St. Peter's Basilica, and the dedication date, which was November 1st, became the day that all saints are remembered. So the night before, the hallowed evening of before, is today our Halloween. And don't ask me how it got to become what it is today. I mean, there's various theories, of course, a lot of pagan, pre-Christian sorts of things that wormed their way in. The theories I remember coming across, one is that people would dress in scary guises in order to keep scary evil spirits away. Another one actually does kind of include little kids and going around looking for candy and whatnot. But anyway, it finally morphed into what it is today, which is sadly something not even for little kids as much as anymore, as grown-ups really enjoy it and apparently enjoy getting dressed up in, I guess, what they really want to be. And okay, I'm going to stop right there before I really start going off track. So anyway, so that's Halloween. And I think it's important. I had to just preface everything by talking about it. So now let's look at the paragon of Halloween, the guy who I think everyone associates with Halloween more than anyone else, the spook, the monster. And that, of course, would be Count Dracula. I mean, I'm sure there's close seconds, maybe the witch flying on a broom, the mummy, whatnot. All of these, I suppose, are contenders. But I think for me, Count Dracula, you ever see that in the 80s, the Halloween that almost wasn't? It's pretty funny, actually. It was I think it was like a short TV program, and it was all the monsters meeting together. And because Halloween, someone was going to cancel Halloween. And it turned out to be the witch, because she was upset that the king of the monsters, who was Dracula, wasn't sharing power with her. But anyway, I only bring that up because it kind of, again, underscores the idea that the vampire, the Dracula, is the king of Halloween. All right, so who is this Dracula? Let's actually start off with the fake Dracula, the Dracula that everyone seems to know, Count Dracula, the monster. And I think, what we're going to look at here is the sort of evolution of the real Dracula, Vlad Tepes, the Romanian warlord or voivode. We'll talk about him a lot. and how he served to create the fictitious Dracula that we know, and then how that Dracula has also continued to morph and change into the modern era, which I also find pretty fascinating. I think you will too, for the reasons that we will get into. All right. So the fake Dracula all begins. It's a novel. I actually have it here. I actually read it. Well, this isn't. I mean, this is called the Library of Classic Horror Stories, but although most of it is Count Dracula because it's very long. And I read that maybe over like 25, 30 years ago, which means I had to look up what Count Dracula is all about again because I had forgotten. And but as I read about it, I started remembering things about it. And by the way, one of my pet peeves that I have, and I'm going to share it with you because it's actually very relevant when it comes to reading. I think I might have said this before in my live stream about reading, but and this is another perfect example. So I read this book, Count Dracula, Bram Stoker, literally 25, maybe 30 years ago. So okay, give me, obviously you can't expect me to remember everything, but since then, of course, I've been privy to all sorts of movies, shows, whatever that deal with vampires, that deal with Dracula. Most notably Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is actually named after the author. That's the most famous, I think, Dracula, which I've watched quite a number of times. And I think it's actually a good movie overall. Okay. It was made in the 90s, I believe. I just like it primarily for Anthony Hopkins, I think. But anyway, my point is that here's another perfect example of you read a book and you imbibe it and you absorb it and it's in your mind, and then you watch movies and adaptations about books, and then years later when you stop and try to think about the book, only images from the movie pop in and I completely forgot the book. I think I might have talked about this before with like Lord of the Rings, where I've read the books, but then I watch the movies. And then before you know it, when I think of Lord of the Rings, I just get scenes out of the movies, which are not necessarily even in the book. All right. That was just a little detour that I just had to get out there. Another call to actually read more and watch less, because one will always supplant the other. And you don't want Hollywood supplanting and having the final word over books. All right, enough said. So let's get into it. So Bram Stoker wrote his book, his novel, Count Dracula. I believe I wrote it. I discussed this in my book, Defenders of the West. I think it came out in 1894 is when he wrote it. And so he based it basically, and it's written in it's actually written in a nice way. It's like it's realistically, it's written in diaries and letters, and it gives it sort of a realistic veneer, and that's kind of what he was going for. Obviously, that's what a good novelist would do. And part of that, of course, is he wanted to give it a realistic setting and even possibly ground it in someone or a historical figure who could somehow feed into the idea of Count Dracula. So having done a few, actually the book came out in 1897. See, I wrote it down here and I'm just going off the top of my head. Now, 1897. And he wrote the book. So basically he did like very easy research, and he came across a writing about a guy named Dracula. And he learned that he was pretty vicious and violent, and he lived somewhere in that region. He was Wallachian, but anyway, he placed it in Transylvania, which is somewhere up north of Wallachia. And he got the story. And the story, just to summarize, spoiler alert, in the book, and which is also in a lot of the movies, you get this guy Jonathan Harker. He's English, and he goes to Transylvania because some count wants to purchase properties, and he's there, and he goes, and then he finds, before long, he realizes this is a vampire, and he gets trapped, but eventually escapes. But in the meantime, Dracula makes it to England, and he starts preying on these people who are close to Jonathan Harker, especially two women. One would be Jonathan's fiancée, I think Mia, and then the other one, Lucy, who he basically starts sucking on and killing eventually, very early on. And he tries to do the same thing with Lucy, or I'm sorry, Mia. And then, but then Harker's back, Jonathan Harker, and he meets up with Van Helsing, I think the Anthony Hopkins figure in that movie, at least. and they figure out he's a vampire, and then the hunt begins to kill Dracula or to stop him somehow. And well, and eventually they do. They succeed. Um, Now, what's really interesting is let's actually first start talking about the differences between what Bram Stoker wrote and what we know today. Okay, so actually, if you read the book and it's a good book. I mean, from what I recall, Bram Stoker's novel, it's much better than the movies. But if you read it, what you're going to be struck with is that. So let's compare with the movie. You're familiar with, let's say, with the Bram Stoker movie, '90s one that I was referring to, the most famous one, I think. And I would argue a lot of it is very accurate. It's very based on the book, which is what makes it more troubling, because the closer it is to the book, and then it has just a few things off, the more your mind is prone to absorbing it as the real thing. Anyway, so it's very accurate, but where does it veer off? All right, it veers off in this sense. First, Dracula in the book, in the novel, is a disgusting figure, not in any way, shape, or form sympathetic. He's literally a monster. Okay. He's not something that anyone finds appealing, nor does he have some sort of unrequited love that he's trying to rekindle. Okay. He's literally a monster that needs to feed on blood. Pretty hideous, physically repulsive, the way he's described. Okay. And now in the movies, we don't get that, do we? Dracula tends to be kind of a suave, hip, kind of an aristocrat, kind of sexy, as it were, right? That's not in the book. You know what? Another book and movie that just came into my mind that's very similar, because I read it, is man, what's it called? The one with Phantom of the Opera. If you watch the movie or the play, or it's a musical, the one that came out in the 2000s. If you watch that one, he's a sympathetic, kind of very handsome. I mean, he's a little disfigured, but he's a handsome, romantic kind of guy. In the actual book, The Phantom of the Opera is just a monstrosity. Nothing whatsoever sympathetic or appealing about him, nor is he even romantic. Okay, so it's interesting to see that these books, that's how they present these guys, and then in the movies, they're always sympathetic, they're misunderstood, they're just they're just looking for love. Okay, yeah, interesting stuff. But anyway, back to Dracula. So total monstrosity, number one. Dracula. Number two, he's just out for blood. Okay, and yeah, he does prey on females, and I suppose even in the book, it's kind of hinted at that maybe there's, I mean, I don't remember anything about him being sexual, but if you're preying on females, maybe there's, instead of males, so there must be something sensual involved, perhaps. But the woman Mia is not only is she repulsed by him, and there's no romantic overtures or kind of mutual romance between them. She's actually very pure, very Christian, very devout, very pious. And that's sort of, why Dracula is attracted to and wants to feed on her, because she's this innocent sacrificial victim, essentially. All right. And that's an old theme, of course. But in the movies, again, what do we get? Not only is Dracula sort of a romantic kind of guy who's misunderstood, but even Mia, they have this bond eventually, and she's in love with him and whatever, right? That's how it comes out. All right, so none of that at all is in the book. Bram Stoker, to his credit, whatever he may have done to the original character of Vlad Tepes, which we'll get into, he was at least he was actually a devout Christian, and the book, the novel Dracula, has very strong Christian themes in it. This is where you get the cross, holy water, all of that burns and terrorizes the vampire Dracula, right? It's straight from Bram Stoker's. The more pious someone is, the more, including with relics and holy images and so forth, the more power that has against unmitigated evil, as embodied by Dracula. Okay. Now again, think about how that has also changed. Okay. So, if you really watch the old movies with, what's his name? Bela Lugosi, or Yeah, I'm sure someone will correct me, something like that. And Bela Lugosi. If you watch all those old movies, the earliest ones, I guess from the 30s, maybe 40s, and they still kind of preserve the cross thing. Oh, the cross, holy water, the name of Jesus or God does have an unequivocal impact on Dracula. But as the decades go by and we continue getting Dracula movies, you start finding that the cross has no power. It actually goes in phases. Okay, in the very early ones, maybe in the 50s and 60s, the cross still has power as long as you have faith in it. Okay, which is fair enough. But if you don't, it's destroyed, and the vampire laughs at you. But if you go and you fast forward to to more recent times, generally the cross and anything Christian is laughed and mocked at by the vampire. It has absolutely no power. Okay, and that's in keeping with the times, or at least the minds of Hollywood, and what they would have you know. So even in that, even in what fends off and what defeats and what scares and the vampire, the evil, Christianity and its symbols, Bram Stoker, at least he presented it. So in short, the Bram Stoker Dracula novel is a very Christian novel. It's very, there's nothing, he doesn't romanticize being a vampire, being a bloodsucker. The Dracula character is not sympathetic at all. He's purely the antagonist. And the good characters, let's say, for example, Mia, it's not because she doesn't reciprocate any sorts of lust or love towards Dracula. But she is a pure and virtuous woman who tries to resist him as much as she can, including with the cross and what we were talking about. And so, in and of itself, I find that pretty interesting. That whole evolution of how Dracula has changed. Okay, from being a monster, just again, like I told you, and you see this a lot in these old writings. I already mentioned, so along with Dracula, I already mentioned. One moment. I already mentioned Phantom of the Opera. And another one we can put in, I think, is Frankenstein. I read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein also a long time ago. And again, not a very sympathetic character, Frankenstein. Today, he's just, again, I'm just a misunderstood being made up of dismembered bodies, and everyone doesn't get me and doesn't understand me. And I guess all of that goes with this new idea that they want you to believe, which is if something appears bad or evil, it's actually you. It's deep down inside, it's good, and it's just trying to overcome and reach out to you and be your buddy and just understand it. And I find it funny that in the old days, these novelists would write it and they would present evil, but it was still evil in their minds, and everyone understood it as evil and bad, not something to emulate or romanticize or heroize. But now in everything from traditional literature, let's say, the bad guys are now somehow, they're really the good guys because society is just too judgmental. Sound familiar? It just doesn't want to give them a break. They're not being Christian enough. They're not turning the other cheek, being doormats and letting Frankenstein and Dracula have their way. Another one that comes to mind and I recall is Grendel. If you recall, Grendel is the monster from Beowulf. Beowulf is Anglo-Saxon early writing. I think 8th century. I might be wrong, but anyway, the hero Beowulf fights against the monster Grendel, who in the actual poem is a monster, not sympathetic. But there's an actual book named Grendel, which I read way back in high school. Short book, and I don't remember when it came out, 80s maybe, or 70s. And the theme is how Grendel, this otherwise evil monster, is actually a good kind of misunderstood guy. And if you could just kind of like rise above your prejudice because he's a monster who eats people and just, not judge, you'll realize he's kind of like you. He just wants to be a normal guy. And, but he was handed a he wasn't lucky, let's put it this way, because he was born a monster. So anyway, my point is I've been seeing this for a long time, where literature written in the 1800s, let's say, or even before, Beowulf is a millennium before or more, And you start in there's a moral clarity in even literature. This is good, this is bad, this is the good guy, this is the bad guy, and we know that because the good guy acts good and the bad guy acts bad, right? Pretty, but now that's too simplistic and you have to be nuanced, right? And that's why I think we're getting all this kind of shift to always try to show you how the bad guy is really the good guy and the good guy is a meanie. So going back to the Grendel and Beowulf, oftentimes in these renditions, and you see this in the movies too, they carry on. And so now Grendel's again kind of a misunderstood misfit monster who just eats people. And all right. Don't ask. All right. These animals, I can't take it anymore. But anyway, so, all right. I'm going off on tangents again, and it's time to wrap this up. So, all right. The Dracula, the actual book, again, very black and white. Dracula is actually, in fact, an antichrist figure. The idea of blood, he drinks your blood and he damns you. It's kind of he's an antichrist. Christ sheds his blood and he saves you, right? So there's a it's actually the book is very good as a novel, from the late 1800s. But the adaptations and the movies, well, they have an agenda, don't they? Like every movie made has an agenda. All right. And like I said, well, actually, let me move on. All right, let's now start moving into the actual Vlad the Impaler. So as I told you, he tried Bram Stoker. He did some travels. He did a little research. He already had the idea. I think his the novel was going to be called Count Vampire, but he came across this character named Count Dracula, and like I told you, he read enough about him to go, oh, this guy was pretty ruthless. Let me make him the origin of all this. But to be very honest with you, he literally knew nothing about Vlad the Impaler. It was just a name and a place, and he got the place wrong. Okay, like I told you, Vlad is in what would be called Wallachia, but he actually placed him a few hundred miles, I think, north in Transylvania, and he just went by. And Dracul, and we'll get into that, just means the dragon, and he thought that was kind of cool. It's a pretty nifty name. And we'll get into the blood stuff, why he drinks blood, because there is some backing to that. And at any rate, all right. So, in short, the connection between the Bram Stoker's Dracula and the historical fellow we're about to discuss is purely nominal and atmospheric. It's basically a writer's creative borrowing, which is fine for a fiction writer. It's not he didn't mean to present a historical link, and in fact, it was actually much later after the novel came out that even people were able to make that link that, oh, he actually based that the vampire Count Dracula was Vlad the Impaler. It took actually several decades for even anyone could figure that out because he didn't explicitly say it because he didn't explicitly know it, and it was found out much later, many years after he had died, Bram Stoker, and it was actually by historians and so forth and whatever. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about who Vlad Dracula was. The Count Dracula, this big evil monster that dominates this season, Halloween. Okay, we saw a little bit about who he was in the book, and he was a monster, definitely. Even though now he's been romanticized and sexualized and glamorized, but now let's look at the real original fellow that he's based after, who I know a fair bit about, much more than Dracula. All right. So Vlad he's now known, if you want to talk about him, he's known as Vlad. His real name, the way he would sign it, was Vlad the Third Dracula. Dracula was just a title, and it was taken from his father. His father, Vlad II, was a member of the Order of the Dragon, which was, I think, initiated by the Hungarian king Sigismund. and it was an order of knights, and it was known as the Order of the Dragon. And his father, Vlad II, was a member of it. And so actually, Dracul means dragon, whereas Dracula means son of the dragon. So he took the name, I'm Vlad III, Dracula, son of the dragon, son of the guy who was a member of the Order of the Dragon. Now he's born around, I mean, the dates kind of are hard to figure out, but I usually give the date 1430. Some say 1428, some say 1431, but let's go with 1430. And like I said, his father, Vlad II, was so you have to familiarize yourself with this term, voivode. Voivode is it basically means warlord. Okay, and that was a big thing back then. Voi means war, and vode means lord or leader. So essentially means a warlord. And back in those days, being a warlord means you are the political leader because that's how you become a king. This idea that we kind of have, and you see it in movies, where a king is this kind of effete, soft, lame guy that just sits around and drinks and eats and and he's like a disgusting, weak person. That also is a bit of Hollywood. Back in the day, if you're going to be a king, you had to prove it, and you're not going to get followers. Who you had to be at the head of the war. Okay, so when I use this word, the voivode, people like Dracula and Dracula and all these guys, they were at the head of the war, at the army. They were the leaders of the war. And this is why people respected them. And this is why they became leaders of men and kings and so forth. So again, I tell you this because I think there's this sort of attack on the idea of monarchy. And, have at it, attack it all you want. And one of the ways that they try to attack it is to just show you that every king is kind of this spoiled, sort of weak, pathetic, spineless person who just sits around in his whatever, in his castle, enjoying his whatever harem and et cetera, et cetera. And while there was that, especially later, much later, closer to our times, in the days we're talking about, no, if you're going to be a king, your life was hard. Okay, you were generally going to be at the head of the war, and that's the only way you're going to remain king, because you have to prove it to your men. All right. So I tell you all that again as context for his father and for himself as well. So his father, Vlad II, who was a member of the Order of the Dragon, was born in a very volatile time. Now you have to imagine, we're talking about, so you have the Kingdom of Hungary, which is powerful, and then you have the Ottoman Empire, which is even much more powerful. And in between them, you have little Romania, or as it's mostly known, Wallachia at that time. And it was kind of like a chessboard for both groups. While the Hungarians and the Romanians were both Christian and technically a lot closer, still, as a matter of realpolitik, the Hungarians used the Romanians as a way, or they would help. They would help whichever contendant to become voivode would help their cause. And the Ottomans were even worse. They would the Ottomans. One thing that people don't really know is they really thrived on the idea of divide and conquer. When you talk about the Ottomans and you look at the sources, of course they could marshal behemoth armies, and they terrorized, and they were very ruthless as a war machine. But lesser known is the sort of machinations that they actually would play, and how they would often pit various forces against each other, how they would put Christian against Christian, because they're the superpower. And then you have these various Christian principalities beneath them. Some are resisting, some have given up and become subjects. And this is, in fact, was the case eventually with Wallachia, whereas Hungary still hadn't. And so then there was a lot of, sort of diplomacy and manipulation that would go on. And the Ottomans were known, and in my book, Defenders of the West, I talk a lot about this, but they were just known as masters of manipulation. They would, extend an olive branch to this guy, even while they were instigating against the other guy, and then doing it so the first guy can fight their guy, and then they would, once he wins, then they would turn him into an enemy. So it was a real quagmire. When you hear about the balkanization, that goes way, way back. Okay, you'll see that when you read the books and you read the sources. It was very fragmented, and above and beyond the idea of Christian and Muslim. I mean, still that was the general fabric. but it would get so bad at certain times that you had a lot of Muslims and Christians who would orbit the Ottomans because it was safer and better for them at that time, until they got betrayed. And anyway, I tell you all that again because it's very important to understand the roots of Vlad the Impaler, Vlad III, Count Dracula, because his father was right smack in the middle of all that. He became the voivode, the warlord of Wallachia, through the help of the Hungarians. But then before long, after King Sigismund died and he sort of was on his own and the Ottomans were pressuring Wallachia, he became subservient to the Ottomans. And in this sense, he became a vassal of the Ottomans. This is the father of of Vlad, of Count Dracula, who we're talking about, Vlad III. And it's interesting because when you read the sources about him, you get the impression that, okay, he's, I'm a vassal of the Ottomans, the Muslims, and I'm going to do what they want. And he did. But he would always, you could tell, it was very heavy on his soul because he would attack fellow Christians as part of the Ottoman army, because he had to, because if he didn't, he'd be attacked. It was one of those things. And it comes out in the sources, how it just would weigh heavily on him. So he was definitely in a very bad spot. And he would vacillate back and forth. So when he would feel that the Hungarians were strong enough and there's gonna be a push against the Ottomans, he would immediately sort of turn his back on the Ottomans and try to side with the Hungarians, where his true loyalties, that is, with fellow Christians, lay. And so at one point, the Ottoman Sultan Murad II was cognizant of this sort of vacillation going on, and he summoned Dracula II, the father of our character, to court, and immediately threw him in prison, abused him, and was going to kill him. But then he realized that the Hungarians now were actually taking over Wallachia and reinforcing it with their own men. So he figured, okay, I'm going to relent. I'm going to give you one more chance, Dracula II, the father. I'm going to send you back, but as a promise of assurance, I need 2 of your sons as hostages. And this is a very, very common Ottoman practice, of course, which you would take the sons of nobles as a way of keeping them hostage, so you can try to ensure that the nobles do what you want them to do. So Vlad II, the father, submitted 2 of his sons. And the oldest stayed with him in Wallachia. The 2 sons, their names were Vlad, who became Vlad III, our character Dracula, and his younger brother Radu. And they basically became hostages of the Ottomans. So Vlad, like I told you, he's born around 1430, and he becomes hostage right around 1442. So he could have been anywhere from 10 to like 13, 14 years old. And his brother was about 5 years old. His brother's known as Radu the Handsome, and we'll get into what all that means. Anyway, so they become hostages, very young age. They start learning Turkish. They're essentially in a fortress. And when you read the sources, including what secondary historians write, it's pretty graphic stuff what they went through. I mean, imagine you're 12, 10, 9, 6, whatever, yanked from your family, you're a Christian, and you are thrown essentially into a prison. I think it was in an island, garrisoned by Turks, soldiers who, at any moment are ready to kill you if you do anything wrong. So they spent years like that. This is important to keep in mind once we get into the depravities of Vlad the Impaler and why he became the way he was. And the father, I was telling you, who would often vacillate. So, at one point, I think at the Crusade of Varna, a big crusade in 1444, he actually joined it against the Ottomans. So he actually reneged. And he even wrote in a letter, we have it, I quote it. He writes and talks about how I just gave up my sons, to join the Christian cause. I hope everyone understands I've sacrificed my 2 sons because now they're going to be killed at best. But lo and behold, they weren't. And that's because the Sultan Murad II was pretty smart. And he still, who knows what he did to them, all right? Maybe it was worse than death. But we know they didn't die. And that's because the Sultan was smart enough that he wanted to keep them as bargaining chips. And he did, in fact, use them later on. All right. And then, so eventually, because of all this vacillation and this guy, Vlad II, is trying to, on the one hand, appease the Sultan, on the other hand, trying to appease the Hungarians. and he's always vacillating, and he's obviously between a rock and a hard place, as they say, trying to save his kids, etc. He gets killed by the Hungarians and gets overthrown. All right, and now at this point, so at this point, now the Turks have Vlad the Third, our Count Dracula. Excuse me. They have Vlad the Third, our character, and his brother Radu, and now the Hungarians are taking over Wallachia and implanting their own men. So the Sultan decides, all right, I got this guy. He's been my hostage. I've groomed him, and he definitely groomed his brother Radu, and we'll get into that. So I'm going to trust him. I'm going to tell him, hey, you can go and you can conquer. I'm going to help you take Wallachia, and then of course you are my vassal, like your father before me. And apparently, the young Vlad III agreed, and he went, and apparently he was very young, and he actually did win over Wallachia, but he was overthrown in a month, and then he just disappears, and we don't know much about what he did historically. He literally disappears for almost, for like a decade, and then in 1456 he reappears, Vlad III. He attacks Wallachia, and he does win this time. We don't even know if it's with the Ottomans or not. The first one definitely was, but somehow now he's older. He's born 1430. Now it's 1456, so he's about he's 26, 27, 28, depending on the year. And now he does become the uncontested warlord of Wallachia. All right. Now, some things to keep in mind, the context that very few people keep track of. I already kind of hinted at how volatile that whole area was during this time. And just to give you an idea, okay, so there were 29 different voivodes, warlords, leaders, okay, in just 58 years, between 1418 and 1476. All right. So in 58 years, you had 29 different leaders. I mean, we're talking each leader was less than 2 years that he was able to reign before he was usurped and killed. Okay, so this was definitely a dog-eat-dog realm, and really does come out in the sources, including the people themselves. Everyone was just desperate. Okay, and like I said, the Ottomans and the Islamic Ottomans manipulated it and exploited it as much as they could because they were the super overbearing power around these little Christian statelets. But in and of themselves, there was just a lot of hopelessness and just despair, and everyone, it was like a dog-eat-dog world. And that again comes out this is why, so for starters, I told you that the Hungarians turned against the father of Vlad the Third and killed him. But it was with the complicit help of the Wallachians themselves, who were living under Vlad. And they actually, not only did they kill him, but they took Vlad III's older brother, who was the heir, and apparently tortured him and buried him alive. Okay. And we already saw that when Vlad III, our character, did the first time came and tried to conquer and he won, he was there for a month and then he got ousted. So very, very volatile. And therefore, when he finally came the second time in 1456 and assumed full control, he turned ultra draconian. And apparently, this is what you had to do in this context if you want to stay in power and create some semblance of order. He created an elite guard around himself, elite warriors. It was just a pure military state right when he took over in 1456. Okay, and then the Turks, of course, decided, hey, let's figure out where this guy's loyalty lies. Is he like he was before and like his father was? Is he going to pay his tribute and be a vassal or not? And I'm going to read you a quick quote. This is from an important source. It's all of this, by the way, is in my book, Defenders of the West. This one. I have a chapter 8, the last chapter, which is all dedicated to Count Dracula. And actually, it's one of the longest. It's about 40 pages. So all the stuff that I'm just giving you a quick summary. If you're interested and you want to learn more and you want the actual documented source, it's all in there. Okay, so I'm going to read to you one of the quotes that's in there. And it says, quote, Vlad, defended the peasants from Turkish demands by refusing to pay the tribute. once he actually gained power, in both money and kind, meaning grain, horse. And he also steadfastly opposed all Turkish endeavors to enroll Wallachian children in the Janissary Corps. So what are they talking about? Well, they're basically saying once he took over, he acted like a Christian prince. No more. He was not like his father. Okay, he was not going to bend to the Ottomans. He was not going to play their game. He was not going to offer them any allegiance, even if it was superficial. And he just immediately, along with turning Wallachia into a military state in as much as he could, he also stopped sending any kind of tribute, stopped dealing with the Ottomans, and certainly stopped sending their youth. The Janissaries, for those who don't know, was basically one of the Ottoman institutions after you conquer a Christian realm, including Wallachia, Hungary, the Slavic nations, and so forth, was you would go and through the city, now that the people have been subdued and they're paying tribute and they have no choice, you would go through the little villages and find the healthiest, strongest, smartest, best looking boys and take them. And you would take them to the Ottoman court to be trained, to essentially be indoctrinated. They would be circumcised, they'd be forced to become Muslim, and they would be trained, if they were militarily capable, to become jihadists. Okay, and if they were intellectual, they'd be administrators, but they would somehow be taken to serve the Ottomans. Okay, and that's it's such a diabolical thing. And when you read the sources and how the early Christians described it, it was pretty bad. I mean, there's sources of mothers screaming, holding on to their children, and the Ottomans slapping them, fathers protesting, getting killed on the spot, parents mutilating their children. So when the Ottoman scouts come looking for them, they just don't want them because the guy's a cripple, can't walk, cutting their feet off, cutting their hands off. That's how desperate they were. So this is what Vlad immediately said no to. Okay, now that I'm in power, we're not doing that. So Muhammad II, this guy, Muhammad II, also known as Mehmed II. I say this guy because no matter what I do and all the studying and research and writing I do about history, he always pops up. It's like the most dramatic, savage, wild stuff always centers around his rather long reign, because he became Sultan, Ottoman Sultan, when he was only 19 years old. And but he also died kind of early in his 50s, apparently killed by one of his sons. But he was around for at least 3 decades, and those 3 decades saw everything from the conquest of Constantinople to a lot of what we're talking about now. But he seems to always figure prominently, and he's, by the way, one of the most beloved figures in Turkey. And if you compare and contrast what this guy did to what Western heroes who are hated now did, night and day. Okay, I did a video recently about Christopher Columbus and Muslims complaining about him, and I compared and contrasted Christopher Columbus with this Sultan, Muhammad II, because they lived at the same time, so they're contemporaries. And night and day, honestly. So Muslims are not in a position to be throwing stones in glass houses, being that they live in glass houses themselves. At any rate, so this Muhammad II decided, okay, I'm going to test them out. He's saying no to the Janissaries, the children. I'm going to now and this wasn't formal yet. He knew it was time to send, and he wouldn't. So Muhammad II, excuse me, sent 3 emissaries, Ottoman emissaries, to go and explain to Vlad what he has to give them. And it's a really noteworthy story. I discuss it a lot in the book. I give the sources. But these 3 men, they're described as climbing up something like 2,000 stairs to reach the castle of Vlad, because it was apparently, one of them at least, was apparently kind of high up on a crag of a mountain in the mist. Pretty scary. And they climbed all the way up there, only to confront the voivode sitting in his throne in a dark, grim room. And they came up to him and they basically said, okay, hey, we want to maintain our peace, so where's our money and our 500 boys? All right. So they said, basically, you owe us all this back payments that you haven't been paying since you've come to the throne, and we want at least 500 boys for the Janissaries. And so the first thing that he said to them, he just looked at them and said, why are you wearing your turbans when you're talking in front of me? I'm royalty. and you guys are just entered into my home, you should, as an act of obeisance or at least decency, remove your turbans. Okay. And they said to him, well, this is our custom, which I'm sure he already knew, having lived amongst the Turks, and he was just being rhetorical. This is our custom, and we're Muslims, and we have to wear it. So he said, okay, so I'm going to help reinforce your custom. And he ordered men to come and nail the turbans onto their heads. And so this is the first where we start getting a glimpse that Vlad had something of a dark sense of humor, if you will. And then I have his quote here. And then he, as they were, these brain hemorrhaged Muslims wearing turbans, he threw them back into their boat. And he told them, quote, tell your master not to send his customs to other lords who don't want them, but let him keep them to himself. And they were sent back and sent back bleeding out of their head to Muhammad, complaining about what just happened to them. All right. Now, to show you again, I was just telling you about how, the Ottoman power was not just physical, and the physical component was definitely imposing because they could marshal, oftentimes, according to the sources, up to like 300,000 men, which makes sense because if you understand how the Ottoman war machine worked, or how the Ottoman economy worked, it was based on war and plunder and subjugation and tribute. That's it. Okay. And that's not to say they didn't have a mercantile class or artisans. They did, from the people that they would conquer, and they would profit off of them. But as their own innate economy was just warfare. It was kind of like that's not surprising. That's like a lot of other different peoples, Mongols. I mean, that's how they exist. We exist. Our economies, we take your stuff. We enslave you. And that is exactly what the Ottoman war machine was. So when I say, or when the sources say that 300,000 men were marshaled, and today's modern, historian just says, no, that's not true. That's not realistic. I don't know. It could be because those 300,000 men had nothing else to do but live for war. Okay, it kind of makes sense to me. All right. Anyway, be that as it may. So once Muhammad's emissaries came bleeding out of their heads and complaining, instead of turning to war, which he could have, but because he is slick and cunning, Muhammad II, he actually turned to guile once again. And he had one of his men, who was a Greek convert to Islam, and there was a lot of those, not just Greeks, but Christian converts to Islam, who lived near where Vlad lived, to send sort of honeyed letters to Vlad to say, hey, before this gets ugly, come, you and I, let's talk. Let's come up with some, solution, and I'll talk to the Sultan so this doesn't turn to war. But of course, it was all a ruse. This was meant for Vlad to go there, and this guy, this renegade, would, if not kill him, at least imprison him and take him to Muhammad II, who would have his way with him. But Vlad, because he lived with the Muslims in his youth, actually was wary of what this, supposed honeyed invitation was, and so he came prepared, including with his men in the background hiding. And then when it became clear that this was a false, that this was a ruse and they were trying to capture him, he just launched all-out war. He destroyed the Turkish garrison that he was going to visit, and he captured and almost killed and eventually impaled the Greek renegade that I was mentioning earlier. And then he gathered all, and then in vengeance, outraged that his hunch was right, and sort of maybe in a fury, now that he's killed this first group of Turks, he went and rallied all the men that he could, Wallachians, and came back to exercise his full vengeance on the Turks. And here's the old Russian chronicle. It confirms that Dracula, after he had rampaged, quote, for about 5 days in the Sultan's land, nothing remained. The whole land was made empty. And Dracula drove others who were Christian onto his land and settled them there. And having taken a vast multitude of conquests, he returned. What's interesting about this is, again, here's another first and very early sort of acknowledgement that this isn't just about warfare and who's going to be powerful. There's a religious element here. He went, he fought, he destroyed both the Turks, the Muslims, and those who were subject to them. But then the Christians that he could, he actually took them with him and tried to resettle them in his own lands. Okay, seems kind of altruistic, seems to have a sort of Christian impulse to it, seems to have sort of a crusader mentality. And as we'll see, actually, Vlad did see himself as a crusader. All right. But he was also ruthless, and we'll get into that. And because you had to be at the time. So, in order to impress the Hungarian king, Matthias Corvinus at the time, and as material proof, he, quote, had the noses cut off of all those living and dead, male and female, and sent those noses to Hungary, saying that as many Turks had been defeated and killed as there were of these noses. So he wanted to offer material proof of his efficacy so he can impress the Hungarian king, because he always wanted to get the Hungarians to support his war against the Ottomans, because the Hungarians were much stronger, of course, than the Wallachians at that point. All right. And then, and as usual, he always has the sort of sarcastic rebuttals that he gives. So after all that, then he sent a message again to Muhammad II, saying that this was the only sort of obeisance that Muhammad could ever expect from him. And then he gave the released Turkish officers the following instructions, quote, "Go, tell your Sultan what you have seen here. I have served him as far as I was able, and if my service is pleasing to him, I will serve him still, as much as it is in my power." In other words, the service that Vlad is referring to is killing and chopping the noses off Turks and Muslims. So again, you can see that dark humor at work. And then the chronicle goes on and says that in response, Turks everywhere were so terror-stricken that those who could flee from the Balkans and cross to Anatolia considered themselves fortunate. Even at the Sultan's court in Constantinople itself, there was an atmosphere of consternation, gloom, and fear by the awesome reputation of the Lord Impaler, as the Turks began to call him. Okay? Because a lot of those that he killed and mutilated, he also impaled. And we'll get into that again. So, a lot to be learned in this little segment right here. First, keep in mind, the Turks were the ones who terrified everyone at this point. They're the scary ones, not these little Christian, rebels and fighters. So he just completely terrified them, including all the way in Constantinople. And that, as we will see, was actually the main point. A lot of what Vlad did, all these sort of sadistic things, the impalement especially, was a terror tactic that was required by a weaker foe, a weaker combatant, namely him and his people, the Wallachians, against this behemoth known as the Ottoman Empire. And we'll get into that. Anyway, so it was war. At this point now, Muhammad II, first he tried diplomacy, then he tried to trick him, and now, it just gets worse and worse, so he declared war. And now his own people, his own Ottoman subjects, all the way in Constantinople, today Istanbul, are terrified. Okay, so and right around 1462 is when this begins, and Muhammad starts marshaling one of the largest armies ever to enter into Christian territory, in this case Wallachia. According to the sources, something like 150,000 to 300,000 men. Again, your average, modern historian, without necessarily, a lot of them, they'll try to make you think that, oh, we've looked at the land and we've measured it and we can't imagine, it would not support that many men. More often than not, they're just guesstimating, and they're just basically saying, no, this sounds ridiculous, it can't be. And it may not be, I don't know. But what I'm saying is I wouldn't be surprised when these guys who are writing claim to be eyewitness sources and they say 300,000. I don't find that necessarily very hard to believe, in the context that is what an Ottoman did. An Ottoman was essentially a fighter and a bandit, and they had various levels, from the Janissaries, the top corps, and all the way down. They had these, what are they called? I forget their name, but like vagabonds who would just come in the back just to like vultures. Okay, so whenever the time was right, they would let them loose to just create havoc and see what they can plunder. So these numbers, as big as they are not necessarily shocking to me. At any rate, so Vlad at this point now finally turns to, once again, the Hungarian king, Matthias Corvinus, asking for help. And in fact, right, there was a crusade expected. A few years later, the Pope had called for a crusade, and now, here's the Turks entering deep into Christian territory. So Vlad contacted him saying, "Okay," and the Hungarian king had been given a lot of money and resources to prepare for it. So everyone turned to him, especially Vlad, because the Turks are coming into his country. And here's a letter. I'll read to you a quick letter that actually survives, where Vlad implores King Matthias Corvinus. He writes, quote, "Because by no means do we want to leave unfinished what we began, but to follow this through to the end." So he's basically saying, look, we the Wallachians have, started a fight with the Ottomans, and we don't want to put an end to it. We don't want to just stop it. We want to put an end to it the right way. We want to defeat them and declare absolute liberty. Okay, he continues, quote, "Because we will not flee before their savagery, but stand by all of the Christians. And if he will kindly lend his ear, the king, Matthias, to the prayers of his poor subjects and grant us victory over the infidels, the enemies of the cross of Christ, it will be the greatest honor, benefit, and spiritual help for your majesty and for all true Christians. Again, we will not flee before their savagery, but by all means we will fight them. And if, God forbid, it ends badly for us and our little country is lost, your majesty will not benefit from this either, because it will be a loss for all Christianity." Keep in mind, Wallachia is sort of a buffer ground between Hungary, the Hungarian Empire, and the Ottomans. So that's what he's referring to. So against the 150 or 300,000, up to 300,000 Turks that Mahmud marches onto Vlad's land, the best that he can gather is about at most 30,000 Wallachians, Christians. And these guys are described as, they're just shepherds, cowpokes running around, and their weapons are rakes and farm weapons. They have no armor, okay, against a war machine that's coming for them. That's how they're described. And this was, again, the case a little earlier. The same sort of thing was happening between Muhammad II and Skanderbeg in Albania. And it's very much a similar story, actually. So the Turks enter and start devastating all the Wallachian lands. They started, all the women and children are taken captive. Vlad had ordered to evacuate them and hide them in caves and so forth, but a lot were found. A lot were found because Vlad's brother, Radu, okay, so Radu, if you recall, I told you Vlad and his younger brother were hostages as kids of the Ottomans. And it was very, very common amongst the Ottomans that when they take Christian hostages, boys, they would molest them and essentially turn them into what's called a catamite. And we know this often happened, I believe, from the sources, it sounds like it happened to Skanderbeg, the great hero of Albania. But, to his credit, he rose above it, and he fought back, and he never allowed that to sort of dominate himself and become overly traumatized, because he knew this wasn't his will. It was forced upon him as a child. Okay. And apparently it was also pushed on Vlad. But according to the sources, the Turks learned very early on that he's not going to have any of that. And he was very violent and very savage. When he was a hostage, he was constantly being whipped and beat. And you get the impression that he just, and it kind of makes sense. It fits in with his character, as we'll see. But now his younger brother, Radu the Handsome, as he's known, didn't. He actually originally, actually, I'll read to you a little bit. I have a quote about it. Originally, he also repulsed Muhammad II. Muhammad II was a notorious pedophile, and I mean he was homosexual, bisexual, heterosexual, pedophile, anything goes. I have a lot about him in my new book, actually, The Two Swords of Christ, that even shocked me. But so he actually, here's an original source, what it says. It explains how Muhammad II, quote, kept him, Radu, as his lover and maintained him. And it happened that the Sultan was almost killed by the boy, Radu, when he wanted to have sex with him. So initially, the boy didn't want to succumb, Radu, the brother of Vlad. Okay, and he continues. This was when he, Muhammad, had first gained the throne in 1451. He lusted after the boy, who was then age 15, Radu, and invited him for conversation. And then, as a sign of his respect, he invited him for drinks to his bedchamber. So this is Muhammad II inviting Radu, the younger brother of Vlad, when he was a hostage. The boy did not expect to suffer such a thing from the Sultan, and when he saw the Sultan approaching him with that intention, he fought him off and refused to consent to intercourse with him. The Sultan kissed the unwilling boy, who drew a dagger and struck the Sultan on his thigh. He then fled in whatever direction he could find. The doctors were able to treat the Sultan's wound. The boy had climbed up a tree there and was hiding. When the Sultan packed up and left, the boy came down from the tree, began his journey, and shortly afterward arrived at the port and became the Sultan's lover. 20 years later, now we're moving up to the time we're discussing, where the Sultan Muhammad is invading Wallachia. 20 years later, not only was Radu Muhammad's creature, but he also had a claim to the Wallachian throne, no less than his brother. And he could promise the Wallachians what Vlad would and could not, which means peace with the Turks. So very important to keep in mind the role of Radu, the younger brother of Vlad II. Okay, so he comes with Muhammad II, and he actually, because he knows Wallachia, because he was there as a youth, he tells them where all the women and children are hiding. And they go and they find them and they slave them and they take them back to Turkdom. Okay. And all this time, Vlad, outnumbered, is engaged in guerrilla warfare, he and his men. Okay. They're hoping to buy time. They're hoping that Matthias Corvinus, the Hungarian king, true to his vow to crusade and who had gotten all this money from the Pope and all these magnates to actually go and help, that he too would. And so he kept waiting. So he's playing this guerrilla warfare game now, and just trying to fight back in the middle of the night. Any kind of straggling Ottoman detachment, they would jump on and kill. But they couldn't really stop the general beast from moving, this behemoth army, because it outnumbered them by almost 1 to 10. So now this continues going on, and he's waiting for the Hungarian king, and now Muhammad is almost near to Vlad's own castle. All right. So in desperation, and this is probably what he's most famous for, Dracula, he did what's known in the sources as a night raid. And basically, he took a small group of men, which amounts to thousands in this context, and invaded the Sultan's camp, which probably had, who knows, 20, 30,000 men surrounding it. And the goal was to try to basically decapitate the snake's head, Muhammad II. And in the hope that if he could kill the Sultan and assassinate him, this large army would just kind of, crumble away and leave. So in the middle of the night, he and his thousands of men, just like 3 a.m., came just barging in the darkness, holding torches. And of course, keep in mind, no Muslim, no Turk was expecting this, because this was very suicidal. And they went basically slaughtering anyone in sight, looking for the most magnificent pavilion or tent, hoping to find Muhammad himself so they can kill him. And apparently they got and they were led by Vlad himself, of course, because he's the warlord. And apparently they created so much terror for the Muslims and consternation that Muhammad himself ran off in the middle of the night in his nightgown. This imposing Sultan who was coming to conquer and take over, he had to flee in the middle of the night. And at that point, they killed many people and he fled, so they couldn't accomplish what they wanted. And a lot of their own men, a lot of the Wallachians were killed during this desperate sortie. And then they finally returned, and the morning came, and in retaliation, because he was embarrassed at what happened, Sultan Muhammad ordered as many Wallachian peasants could be found, the ones hiding or thinking they're safe because they're not involved. And he got something like 3,500 of them and had them all ritually beheaded and sawn in half as retribution for the audacity of Vlad's attempt against his life. At any rate, they get to continue, marching unopposed with just slight attacks from the guerrilla army of Vlad until they reach his castle. And it is there. This is the famous, if you've heard of it, it's called the Forest of the Impaled, or the Impalement Forest. And basically, what Vlad was fond of doing is around his castle, he had apparently hundreds, if not thousands, of his enemies staked and impaled and surrounding his castle. Okay. And again, this was meant, of course, to be a chief terror tactic. And it actually worked. All right. Let me read you a quote. So, when the Turks finally arrived at the castle and they saw this sight and realized that the castle of the impaled was not just a rumor, but a reality, they quote, they saw there thousands of stakes of various heights, which held the remaining carcasses of some 20,000 Turkish captives. Their bodies were in a state of complete decomposition due to the heat of the summer and the ravages of ravens and other Carpathian birds of prey, many of which had made their nest within the skulls and skeletal remains of the victims. Barely recognizable because of the higher stakes used in deference to their position were the remains of the Greek renegade. Remember the one I told you? I think his name was Yunus Beg, who tried to betray Vlad, and another fellow, Hamza Pasha. So he would, that's what he would do. He would put on a higher, if you had a higher dignity or rank, he would impale you on a higher stake. That dark sense of humor, to signify your status in the military or in whatever the political scheme. The tattered remains of their gaudy vestments fluttered against the evening sky. The entire area reeked with the stench of death, the smell of rotting flesh. Dracula had deliberately stage managed this sinister spectacle as part of his terror tactics to destroy whatever spirit was still left in Muhammad after the unsuccessful assassination attempt a few days before, the one I just read to you, the night attack. Indeed, the Forest of the Impaled was horrible enough to discourage the most stout-hearted Ottoman officers who witnessed the scene. But Muhammad himself decided, well, I'm already here, so we're going to camp out. We're right at his castle. And then, lo and behold, right in the middle of the night, again, Dracula with a few of his men came and further terrorized Muhammad, that Muhammad finally said, I'm out. And he actually took his entire army and left and returned back to, I guess, Constantinople. And so it was one of the most remarkable victories until this day in Romania. It's seen as a victory. However, Muhammad, again, because of his vast resources and power, he left Radu, the brother of Vlad, who I was telling you, his homosexual lover. He left him there with an army, and now once again, not to conquer, but to win over the Wallachians. After all, as the brother of Vlad, he too could be a leader. That was one of the issues with the Wallachian principality. They didn't have primogeniture, so it didn't matter if you're the older brother or younger brother. Either or would work, and that's what led to a lot of chaos, actually, and a lot of infighting. So in this case, Radu presented himself. Hey, I'm a good friend of the Sultan, and if you bow the knee to me, all you need to do is just bow to me, and I'm his friend, and everything will be fine. So more and more of the Wallachians started turning their back on Vlad. Again, remember, this is a very volatile time, and people are desperate and trying to do whatever they can do to survive. Okay, so now all this time, Vlad still won't give up. And he's hiding out, and he still has hope that Matthias Corvinus is going to come and help him out. He's hiding out in the forest with a small group of his fighters. And now Radu is in the capital in Wallachia, gathering all the boyars, all the aristocrats to his side and consolidating basically his power there. And then finally, Matthias appears, and thinking his savior is here, Dracula runs out to meet him, and he's immediately arrested. Okay. And why was he arrested? By supposedly his friend who's coming now to crusade with him. Well, because supposedly the story goes, Matthias had come across intercepted letters that proved that Dracula was actually a traitor and he was working with the Turks and that he was trying to kill him, Matthias. But now when you look, and I do in the book, all the contemporary sources, while admitting that that is the pretext, these letters, they all also, even the Hungarian writers in the Chronicles say this was kind of weird. It didn't make any sense. Why would Dracula, who above all other kings and princes was goading and fighting the Turks, why would he actually have sold out when all he had to do was actually just agree to pay them tribute and he would have been fine? Like, why this convoluted scheme? It didn't really make sense. And in fact, most historians will say it's because what had happened is, remember, there was a crusade, an official crusade, and the Pope and a lot of other magnates had sent so much money to Matthias, the Hungarian king, so that he can prosecute the crusade. And like as you've seen, this was the time when Vlad was calling for his aid, saying it's now or never. You know, here they're coming into our own territory. Help me, but he didn't. So what the main theory that I've come across is that the Hungarian king had already spent the money, and Muhammad had already left. There's no need to go on crusading, and now he just wanted to sort of get out of this whole thing, and he needed a good pretext and a scapegoat, and that became Vlad. So he imprisoned him on the claim that Vlad was actually going to betray Christendom essentially and betray him because he came across these intercepted letters and so forth. And now from at this point, and so now this is about let me see, in 1462. This is right out. Okay, so the war is ending, and Muhammad just left, and Radu's in charge. And in 1462, Vlad is arrested by his savior, and it is from this point on. Now he goes to prison, believe it or not, for I think 13 years. He doesn't come out of prison until 1475. And he's born, I said, around 1430. So he's imprisoned when he's like in his early 30s. And he comes out in his, 40 something, 45 or so when he's in prison. But it is during this time in his imprisonment that we start getting all the horrific and ugly tales about who this Vlad was, right? And this is because, again, this isn't my theory. This is what historians have said, and I documented in my book, Defenders of the West. Check it out. The idea is this is the time of the Gutenberg press, and all the enemies of Vlad gathered in Matthias Corvinus's court, including people who had a lot of grudges against him, the Saxons that he had impaled, but he had impaled them. Even Corvinus had said, you brought it on yourselves because they had betrayed him. Anyway, you get all these, this would be sort of, the 15th century version of fake news. All these new pamphlets from the printing press come out, all these stories that present Vlad Tepes. He's one of the earliest to be covered in by the Gutenberg press, including with fantastical and lurid engravings of him. And all these engravings and letters and printouts are sent all over Europe. And they appear under titles such as, quote, "The frightening and truly extraordinary story of a wicked, blood-drinking tyrant called Prince Dracula." And then these pamphlets essentially become what you would call back then instant bestsellers. And no depravity at this point was spared Vlad. Okay, the stories discussed in graphic detail how he supposedly boiled people alive, shredded others like cabbage, forced parents to eat their children, impaled and broiled, forced husbands to eat their wives' breasts, forced wives to eat their husbands' penises, forced Tatars to swallow their own semen, built secret trapdoors to trap his victims, and then cunningly put stakes underneath the trapdoors. Now, here's the thing. Most historians I've looked at it dismiss these early stories, which came from Matthias's court, as obvious propaganda meant to demonize Dracula and exonerate Matthias from, the claim that he had failed in his obligation for the crusade. Okay, again, this isn't my idea. This is just what most mainstream historians would say, that it's obvious propaganda. And you can see why if you look at the very first German set, as I have, that came out, from beginning to end, line after line, the entirety of the text depicts Dracula engaging in one vile or bizarre act after another, hacking people's ears and noses and limbs and genitals off, blinding them, strangling them, boiling, skinning, roasting, and feeding people to wild animals, and with no word of explanation or context. He just does all this because he's a wild, evil sadist and an immoral monster. In short, the devil's son, as the word Dracul, which used to mean dragon, now starts morphing into the devil. And as we'll see, that becomes the modern day Dracula fiction, the son of the devil. So okay, so just I guess a few observations now. What do we make of all these arguments and all these accusations against Vlad about his nature, the impalement, the cruelties, and so forth? So I already told you that by and large, the stuff that I just read to you is generally seen by objective historians as just, okay, this is propaganda. So what did happen? Well, what did happen, we do know, I mean, there's no denying the fact that he engaged in graphic, what we would call very sadistic punishments. So the impalement's definitely real, okay? And it appears he impaled more people than others did. But that's the first point that we need to look at. Everyone sort of impaled. Impalement was a general form of punishment that was agreed upon. Even the people who complained about him, various Hungarian factions and other Romanians and the German Saxons, they all in their legal documents have impalement as a punishment. So even I think Stephen the Great, who's a very famous Wallachian, he used impalement and he impaled thousands of people. But more to the point, the real chief impalers, just to forget about these Christian groups, were the Ottomans. So once again, Vlad, as a hostage, learned impalement from his Ottoman masters. We don't hear that, but it was the Ottomans who really thrived on and perfected the art of impalement for very sadistic reasons. And that's what he saw. So it's very clear that he adopted these terror tactics against the Ottomans because he was the outnumbered underdog, as I mentioned with the various numbers. And he was just, it was a tit for tat, and he was doing what he could to try to terrify, and it worked, to a degree. It caused Muhammad to eventually leave in shambles, the way he actually ran away after he saw the forest of the impaled, the way it's described. So it did work to a certain measure, considering how small and outnumbered and weak Vlad was vis-a-vis the Ottomans. But even it's funny because the things that were attributed to set aside the impalement, put away the impalement, there's a lot of other sick things that are attributed to Vlad, such as, for example, dining in the midst of his impaled victims. And there's pictures of that, engravings, where you'll see supposedly Vlad sitting and all these people are impaled around him and he's just nonchalantly having his dinner. Well, that actually was a Turkish custom. So, for example, after the carnage at the Battle of Varna, which I mentioned in 1444, Murad II, the father of Muhammad II, held a feast among the corpses of vanquished Christians. That's a direct quote I'm reading from. So again, but you never hear that, do you? Right? And so I'll give you a perfect example. I wrote it down because I remember it. So now that you've seen that it was actually the Muslims who kind of spearheaded and did all these things, CNN had a segment that I saw a while back, some years back, about the Islamic State, and it said that ISIS, the Islamic State, learned its sadistic methods of torture and execution not from its Islamic heritage, which is replete with this is me actually, or this is me talking. CNN said that ISIS did not learn the sadistic methods of torture that we were being privy to, what it was doing, burning people alive, crucifying them, decapitating them, etc. They didn't learn that from Islam, which preaches peace, but rather they learned it, and CNN literally said, from Vlad III Dracula. All right. So that, again, gives you an example of how all this stuff in the end does matter because it gets politicized. All this seemingly, abstract history that, whatever, people think we're beyond those times now. Who cares? It's not relevant. Well, it's being weaponized as usual. So, today when we talk about Dracula, so we've seen the blood-sucking vampire and, and his role and how he has nothing to do with this. But in more recent movies, of course, they do try to tie Dracula, the blood-sucking vampire, to Vlad, the Impaler. I forget, there's one movie that came out maybe 10 years ago. I forget its name, but that's basically what it does. So it's Vlad the Impaler, the historical character, and then he becomes a blood sucking monster for whatever reason. Okay. Um, and never mentioned or never shown is the reality, which is, and this is what I've been battling for like 25 years now. It's called context. What I do with history is simply try to show context. It's not that what people say so and so did isn't true. It's to give you the context of why that was the case. Okay. So you can say whatever you want about the Crusades, they were violent, whatever, whatever. You can say whatever you want about Vlad the Impaler, but the context kind of changes it all when you realize someone like Vlad was the underdog and that everything that he did is what he saw and learned from his abusers when he was a child hostage, and that he was fighting fire with fire any way that he could, and that it was those guys who actually perfected the sadistic art of dining amongst your impaled victims and impaling your victims and all sorts of other things. Isn't that interesting? But today you talk to anybody who's moderately informed about Vlad the Impaler, and oh yeah, well he was a horrible impaler and a monster, etc., etc. And if you ask them, well, what about the Turks? Oh, I don't know. Open-minded people, I guess, just because Islam is moderate. So there you go. Once again, is that issue, which is very important to keep in mind. So, what was the real Vlad the Impaler like? On the one hand, I wouldn't want you to think that I'm trying to say the guy was just a normal happy-go-lucky guy. No, there was obviously something special to Vlad. He was very different in a sense. Of course, everything I said does apply. He was influenced by his childhood trauma, watching his son being turned into basically a boy toy, as it were, of the Sultan, the same Sultan that demanded his allegiance. I mean, little wonder he turned so violently against him, right? When he had the chance. But also seeing all the depraved, sadistic punishments that the Turks would regularly inflict on all and sundry. We have to obviously take all that into account. Or how about the fact that this guy spent a big chunk of his life in prison? So in his youth, he spent maybe like 8 years, at least 6 to 8 years, as a hostage of the Turks. And then, as we saw, Matthias Corvinus imprisoned him from 62 to 75, 13 years. And by the way, it was it was during those 13 years in prison where his enemies, because during those 13 years in prison is when the propaganda machine was talking about what a monster he was. And then that's where they also added that in prison, because he can't stop impaling, he looks around for bugs and insects and rodents to impale them and kill them. So that's where the idea comes from. They actually said that. Again, your average historian will tell you, no, that was probably propaganda. And the idea and the fact of all this actually comes out in the simple development that Matthias Corvinus, who imprisoned him because supposedly he was a traitor, Vlad, after 13 years, he let him out because he needed his help against the Ottomans. And to prove his goodwill, his good faith, Matthias actually offered one of his own cousins, female cousins, to marry Vlad and to be his wife. So that's obviously, the king is offering you his own cousin. That's definitely a good show of sincere intentions. But now, why would he do that? If Vlad was this lunatic who's just sitting around in a cell, passing the time by impaling, I don't know, bugs and eating them, does this sound like someone you want to marry to your cousin and form an alliance with? No, it's because he knew he was an effective warrior. And so anyway, he releases him. And a funny anecdote I'll share with you is that after he releases him sometime in 1475, he sends him to Pest, to sort of rehabilitate and get, readjusted to being in society and not necessarily in prison all the time. But this kind of proved unnecessary, and Dracula was still Dracula, just as he's always been. And so one anecdote is an officer broke into his home, Dracula, looking for a runaway criminal that he thought was hiding in Dracula's courtyard. Vlad instantly decapitated the official with a swing of his sword, and the other officers fled to Matthias, who got angry and sternly questioned Dracula, saying, quote, "Why have you committed such a crime?" Only to receive the far from contrite response, quote, this is now what Dracula says, "I committed no crime. It's the police official who committed suicide. Anyone will perish in this way should he, like a thief, invade the house of a great ruler such as myself. If this man had come to me first and had explained the situation to me, um, and if then the criminal had been found in my own home, I myself would have delivered the criminal over to him and would have pardoned him," the man. So as you can see, uh, even all those years in prison never broke Dracula, which actually is an important point now to segue and talk about his real character. And the best I was able to gather from reading a lot about him is that he was a very, very severe man, very severe, very draconian, but very just. Okay, which is another way of saying, he's the king, right? He's the prince. He's the warlord. If you follow the rules as a man of honor, he's not going to do anything to you. But if you transgress them in any way, shape, or form, yeah, he'll impale you. To him, that will be just punishment. And this goes to the idea. One of the most famous anecdotes is the Golden Goblet, which is, and actually Romania. And keep in mind, Romanians are proud of Vlad. They don't see him as a monster. He's actually, I believe, in whenever you add the top 10 Romanian heroes or heroes of Romania, he usually figures among them. And it's for this reason, because he's seen as, yes, he's draconian, but he's so devoted to justice. Okay, and so the golden goblet myth, and I don't know if it's a myth, maybe it's real, is that supposedly somewhere in his kingdom by a well, he had a golden goblet available so any passersby can drink. And obviously that's deemed insane because anyone's going to steal gold, any peasant who sees gold, but apparently nobody dared touch it. And that's the idea, because he instilled so much fear, so much respect in the denizens of his homeland and beyond, that no one dared transgress his rule, because they knew one false move and you're impaled up on a tree. Okay. In fact, so here's a little quote from one of the earliest sources about him. It's the old Russian Chronicle of Afrosin, and it appeared after less than a decade after Dracula's death. So according to it, quote, "He hated stealing so violently in his country that anyone who caused any evil or robbery, or anyone who lied or committed any injustice, did not live very long. Be he an important boyar," a boyar is like an aristocrat, priest, or monk, "or an ordinary person. Be he the richest man, he would not escape death. So feared was Vlad. As for women, any caught in the act of adultery or just being lazy, she too could expect being staked or worse." Okay, so I'm reading this now. So Vlad was even ruthless with those who would not or could not carry their own weight, vagabonds. And there's a quote, "These men live off this." So supposedly Vlad said this: "These men live off the sweat of others, so they are useless to humanity." He's talking about bums and homeless people, I suppose. Quote, "It is a form of thievery. In fact, the masked robber in the forest demands your purse, but if you are quicker with your hand and more vigorous than he, you can escape him. However, these bums and vagabonds take your belongings gradually by begging, but they still take it. They are worse than robbers. May such men be eradicated from my land." And since he was the voivode, such wishes tended to be realized. Okay. So anyway, Matthias finally releases him in 1475, marries him off to his cousin, and uses him to fight the Ottomans. And in fact, Vlad starts making a lot of, as expected, inroads, and he wins a lot of victories as before. So he takes up right where he left off, and he starts beating the Ottomans in the name of Matthias. And finally he had to do this before he can actually try to reclaim his own Wallachian kingdom. And finally, in 1476, having subdued many of the Hungarian kingdom's enemies, he attacks Wallachia, his own former kingdom, to try to reclaim it. And he gets it, and he wins it again in December of 1476, until betrayal strikes him once again, and he gets killed. The Ottomans finally win. They invade his castle. They kill him. They chop him up into pieces, and they set his head to the Sultan Muhammad II. So, according to one chronicler, an early one, Jacob Unrest, he writes he discusses that what happened, and because it's very, if you look at the sources, there's different logic as how he got killed, but most of them stress a form of betrayal, and especially this one, which is one of the earliest, which I'll read to you. And he writes that Dracula was killed with great cunning because the Turks wished to avenge the great enmity which he had borne against them for so long, and also the great damages he had inflicted upon them. So they hired a Turk, or it could be an Ottoman servant, to act as one of his servants with the mission of killing him while he served him. The Turk was apparently instructed to attack Dracula from the back. He was then to cut off his head and bring it back on horseback to the Sultan. That much was certainly true, because in the end, Vlad's head, like I told you, was sent to and thrust atop the highest stake in Constantinople. Proof to everyone who was terrified that the dread Lord Impaler was finally dead at the age of 47. And so really ended one of the most fascinating figures of his own lifetime. And as we can see, up to our times, and how he's been morphed. So, all right, that's about it. I'm going to wrap it up soon, but just a few remarks about, one of the things that does come out in the sources and that you rarely see and is somewhat suppressed is the Christianity of Vlad. Yeah. I read to you one of the quotes, that he wrote a letter to Matthias, and he talked about standing with Christianity and so forth. And if you look in my book in chapter 8, I have a lot more quotes attributed to him where he says things like, he discusses the Turks as, quote, the cruelest enemies of the cross of Christ. And moreover, and contrary to all the portrayals of him, he was apparently very fond of hanging out with Romanian Orthodox monks. And he was, there's a couple of monasteries that he was known to often spend time with and in. And he also, when he would impose a death penalty upon anyone, he would insist upon proper Christian ceremony so that his victim, if he was a Christian, would get a Christian burial. And, he basically saw himself as a Christian crusader, the son of the dragon, who was a member of an order devoted to fighting the Ottomans. Okay. And he founded monasteries, and he sent large donations to Mount Athos. And he even, quote, created a sovereign church in his country, essentially laying the groundwork for a Romanian Orthodox church. Okay. And I'm reading a quote. This should be recognized as one of his greatest achievements as Prince of Wallachia. Okay. And so, as you can see, you don't hear this part, but he definitely had an interest in Christianity. He saw his war and resistance against the Turks in Christian terms, like almost everyone else did. He saw himself as a crusader, and that was the sort of lens that he was operating through, just like all the other guys, that I talk about in Defenders of the West, for example. Be they Catholic or Orthodox or whatever. So yeah, that's him. And until today, like I told you, another reason that sort of validates him is who knows him better than his own people. So in Romania, Vlad the Impaler, Dracula, is actually still a celebrated figure, like I told you, often in polls appearing in the top 10 most liked and most heroic characters. So that itself should go some way. I mean, who knows Dracula better? Bram Stoker, this Irishman, or 21st century Hollywood movie makers, or the Romanians, who themselves suffered under his rule, as I pointed out. But apparently, there's still a saying amongst the Romanians. Whenever there's a lot of depravity and immorality going on, they say something like, "Where art thou, Dracula, to lay your hands on them all?" Apparently, to go and impale all these whatever immoral people operating. All right, I'm going to end it now. So the final observation, we started a little about Halloween, and I gave you the etymology and how it traces back to Christianity. And we ended up by talking about Halloween's chief denizen, Dracula, and how he also ends up as being a Christian hero. So it's kind of interesting, isn't it? You move to our times, how everything that starts off sort of noble and good and Christian has become emblematic of evil, and in a way, even praising evil. Halloween, from being the eve, where you have a vigil for All Saints Day, is now what it is. And Dracula, who's just a Christian man fighting fire with fire, though any way he could, against the Muslims, is now a bloodsucker and denizen of the night who also, and then on top of all that, I mean, that goes back to Bram Stoker, but at least he would show him as an evil creature. But now he's also sympathetic, Dracula. All these movies and series or whatever that try to praise and glorify vampirism and turn it into something, sexual or glamorous or whatever. So obviously there's a lot of changes going on. And it's just everything that it starts off decent and noble and especially Christian is intentionally being perverted. All right, I'm going to end it there. And let's take a few chats. All right. Ryan. Hi, Raymond. How much time do you spend keeping up with the news versus work and study? I don't watch the news at all. Oh my God. I stay away from that. To me, the news is comedy. To me, the news is what the powers that be have decided you should be talking about today. They don't care if you take a pro or a con position. Okay. It's just the gossip that we all are supposed to opine about. And more often than not, it has zero interest or relevance to me because it doesn't teach me anything. More often than not, it's a development that I already knew was going to happen because I understand human nature. So there's nothing shocking or surprising about it. But when it's time for me to write an article or more frequently do a video, I guess I do begrudgingly try to see what people are talking about, what's considered important. But yeah, I stay away from the so-called news like the plague because it benefits me in no way, shape, or form. And I think it makes me a little stupid. Sorry, but it's really not news. It's just nonsense and gossip dressed up as news. Remember soap operas, which were like for the bored housewife, the way it was presented, I don't know, 70s and 80s. Well, I think the news now is like the substitute. It's sensational. It's meant to be just gossip. And maybe it explains why even more women seem to be tuning into Fox News than men. Okay, so there it is. Jason, I've got to ask, I'm probably a very harsh critic of Islam. Think it's the single greatest threat to humanity in general. Then I look at Albania. Only way I can square it is the old USSR rules. Well, Albania and yeah, all the old, it's not just Albania. I mean, if you look at all the old USSR nations, look at the really Muslim ones like the central, Dagestan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, these nations, and they're not very Muslim, even though they are Muslim nations. These are the descendants of the Tatars who became Muslim. So perhaps I think, yeah, it's that kind of cold, strong iron rule just doesn't allow for the sort of, they don't have time or tolerance for any kind of crazy terrorism in these places. You got to keep in mind, terrorism, Islamic radicalization, all that stuff thrives in weakness, which is why it thrives in Western Europe and it thrives in America and it thrives in any Western nation. It needs a weak setting where people are allowed to do whatever they want, freedom. Okay. And this is why, as you point out, Albania and all these other countries, based on their, communist Soviet history, which is somewhat draconian, not liberal, they don't gravitate towards that stuff. The only way you can gravitate towards it is you need that sort of leftist veneer that allows it, which is, it goes back to the logic of why are the leftists and the Muslims always hand in hand so close? Because the one empowers the other and the other will eat the other one alive when the time comes. Super sticker. Thanks, Michelangelo. Would you consider interviewing Judd Saul from Truth Nigeria, equipping the persecuted? God bless you, Brother Raymond. Looking forward to reading Two Swords of Christ. Yeah, just contact me on my website. And we'll see what we can do. I did a recent interview with a Nigerian clergyman, and that went well. So I'm very happy to do another one. Coltrane. Are you aware of the Zenj revolt that happened in Iraq from 869 883? It was supposedly the largest and longest slave rebellion in history, even irreparably crippled the Abbasid Caliphate. I am familiar with it. The Zenge Revolt. And I got to laugh because the word Zenge, people don't know this, but so the N word, the dreaded N word in English, there's an equivalent of it in Arabic, and it comes from the word Zenge, and it's basically zingi. So if you say a zingi, that's the equivalent of the N word. Black has its own word, iswid. So Sudan, that country which is south of Egypt, it literally means eswed is singular, Sud is plural. So Sudan means land of the blacks. Um, anyway, that was a little diversion, but yeah, I am familiar with it, and it was pretty wild and graphic. And but yeah, don't wait for a Spartacus-like movie about it. Okay, because this involves the Muslim world and it involves black people being treated like animals and slaves. You're not going to be seeing that anytime soon. Katana, are you familiar with Hizb ut-Tahrir? Yes. Odd that a globally designated terror group can operate in Canada. Their Khalifa Conference 2025 about defeat of non-Muslim nations was canceled after backlash. No, it's not odd. I mean, it's bad, it's unfortunate, but it's not odd. And it goes back to what I was saying, which is sort of these liberal policies that allow, empower, enforce, and legitimize having people who are terrorists coming up and sharing their thoughts in a forum, right? I mean, this is a thing that people need to understand. Like this, Mamdami guy who I'm tired of hearing about. He's literally not doing anything wrong. What's he doing? He's running for office, and people don't like it. I get that, but you know what? The system allows it. So instead of getting angry at him, I would look at the system. The system's allowing this sort of thing to happen. So maybe the system is flawed. Maybe not everyone should be participating in the system. But I'm always for looking at the root source of issues. Telling me, oh, this guy is a bad Muslim. I mean, I already expect that. But why is your system allowing the empowerment of this? This is the perfect example when we talk about Europe, and you get all these Europeans upset about the Muslim migration, and they call it an invasion, etc., and they're angry at Muslims. Yeah, but in a way, no, because this is not an invasion, and the root source is not the Muslims. The Muslims are doing what the Muslims are going to do. It's your leaders who make policies who are bringing them and drowning you with them that you need to look at. That's the root immediate source of the problem. But I went off on a tangent. Sorry. Cat Sunday. Finally, I caught this stream. What are your thoughts on people saying Christianity does not inherently condemn slavery and the rise of spirituality? What do I think that Christianity does not inherently condemn slavery? So I guess what you're saying is that there's nothing in the Bible that says slavery is bad. Don't do it. I'm not sure if that's a true statement, but I think it is probably. You're probably talking about Paul and how he tells slaves to be content and all that. Well, my response is simply that, the things that we find so morally repugnant were just normal to most people. Slavery is one of the oldest, most common, just taken for granted institutions throughout history. All right. We may not like it, and I don't think we should like it. I think it's a bad thing, but we can't just kind of project our values on people from 2,000 years ago when everyone was involved in slavery. So the Bible doesn't say slavery is good. It just tells people, hey, put up with what you're doing, live the way, live a good life despite the shortcomings and what you're doing, and deal with it. I know people try to spin it as if saying, see, this means the Bible supports slavery and it wants slaves not to fight back, et cetera, et cetera. Or you could say it's trying to teach people to just live in harmony and peace with their current surroundings. It's a stoic element. You deal with adversity, or in this case, you're a slave. Well, rise above it, and be a good person. You be good to your master. I mean, these are Christian principles. So I don't think Christianity endorses slavery. After all, it's Christians who abolished slavery. All right. It just it was more of a Stoic principle, I think. Kevin got my copy of Signed Two Swords. Ah, Kevin, I believe I signed your book. Are you the guy who told me not to mail it because not to mail it now because you're worried about your current setting and you're traveling? I think so. And if so, I'd be impressed with my memory. But anyway, thank you. Coltrane. With what the Turks did to Christians and their children, can anyone blame Vlad for what he did to them? Enslaving children and then making them fight their own people as janissaries. That's demonic. Yeah. Again, that's a very important point. Thanks for bringing it up. And I spent a lot of times talking about it. By the way, this is the book, Defenders of the West. I have a whole chapter on Vlad and 7 other fellows. But I talk a lot about the janissaries in there for whoever's interested. And the whole point is it is diabolical. I mean, think about it. It's not just, it's one thing to conquer people, but these would, we conquer you and then we take your best sons, okay, intellectual, physical, aesthetically, and we make them our own. And we turn them into jihadists. And then we unleash them back on you to continue the cycle and get your other sons. Pretty diabolical stuff, And how does modern day academia treat it? They actually call it, they've referred to this whole system as the equivalent of a scholarship to Harvard. In fact, the Christian parents were just pushing their kids like, oh, please take my kid, because they knew that if the Ottomans took him, he would live in a rich setting and a very he would be elevated from the current setting because they're just peasants. So he would be ensured a good life. He would eat well, he would live well. This is how a lot of historians now present it. Meanwhile, in the actual sources, you get what I discussed, which is mothers hysterically screaming and crying and being slapped by Ottoman officials as they hold on to their sons, and fathers fighting and protesting and getting just struck down by the sword for daring to interfere. Okay. So, yeah, very, very evil, diabolical, and it was meant basically to bleed the Christians of their best. I mean, think about it. It's like it's a win-win. We take your best and make them our own, and then you lose your own best. Okay, so that don't expect that to be mentioned anywhere in academia because it's unflattering to the Muslims. E. Alphonse, thank you. Thanks again, E. Alphonse. A lazy prodigy. Never thought I would stand with Dracula, but God rest and bless and forgive the impaler. Yeah, and that's another point. I don't want anyone to think I am I'm not trying to overly heroize anyone. Again, my goal is to give you context, background. I mean, all the men, I say this in this book, Defenders of the West. I have a whole section where I say basically, you know what? These guys are heroes. I call them heroes, but in the end, they're fallible men. So you can expect all sorts of warts and bad things. They're not perfect. Okay, there's something to them. They were heroic. They cared about their civilization, their culture, their religion, but they're not saints, except for Saint Louis and Saint Ferdinand, because they literally were saints, actually. But by and large, well, Dracula certainly wasn't a saint. Flippy Muhammad the second sounded like a Zut type of. Oh, by the way, stay tuned. I have an important Zut announcement to make. I have a video coming out soon on the Zut. But anyway, yeah, he definitely was a Zut type of guy. Actually, pederasty and homosexuality was amongst Europeans and Christians known as the Ottoman or the Turkish disease. It was a very, very apparently frequent thing where the Turks would, degrade and sexually abuse young Christian European men and turn them into sodomites and catamites, just like in our story, Radu, the handsome, poor guy. He shouldn't have been handsome. Coltrane, Vlad was always raising the stakes. so to speak. No pun intended, huh? Flippy. Muhammad II ran in a nightgown. Original Muhammad. May Zut be behind him, ran in his CB's garments. uh, to think this Zut stuff was out there for so long, and it's become so popular. Moon Valley, thanks. Flippy. In Japan, there is an Egyptian lady. She has a YouTube channel who rallies against Islamic migration in Japan, but says Islam is peaceful and against preaching. Okay, kind of contradictory, no? Okay. Methinks that's it. We've gone on for quite some time. And closing thoughts, like I already pointed them out, but just to stress them, I just find them interesting. That Halloween, even Halloween, which everyone thinks is this kind of scary, evil time, it's All Hallows Day. It's just like you say, hallowed be thy name in the Lord's Prayer. So it's the holy day, marking the day after, which is All Saints Day, but it's been turned into what it's been turned into. And Vlad the Impaler, for all his warts and imperfections and frailties, was a hero, still seen as a hero by his countrymen, who fought in the name of Christianity against Muslim terrorists, essentially, who enslaved and tortured him and enslaved and raped and abused his own brother and father. And he did what he could. And now he too is not just a vampire who drinks blood, but also engaged in. But he's also, the more they present him in the fictional sense, the more he's actually a good guy. He's sympathetic because he doesn't believe in God and he hates the cross. And all right, get off. It never ends with these things. And so, all right, good. I'm ending it. All right. Thanks for joining me. Until next time, have a good week and take care and stay tuned for El Zut announcement. Bye.